Hi, this is Cheryl Gallant, your Conservative Member of Parliament for the freedom-loving riding of Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke. Last week, when we updated you, the new U.S. President was being sworn in. As we know, the first thing he did as an expression of cooperation with our federal Liberal government was cancel the Keystone Pipeline. Trudeau has barely been able to contain his glee. He's reveling in the misery of Albertans. They have been betrayed. Talk of Western alienation plays right into Trudeau's hands. He enjoys seeing his political foes fighting amongst themselves. Why should every one of us care? Not too long ago, Alberta was the economic engine of Canada. Its success fueled the pension funds for our seniors. The wealth from the West boosted economically the rest of Canada. The province fell to the socialists, and the rest is history. Ontario, too, used to be Canada's economic engine before Alberta, but after 13 years under socialism, our economy was killed as well. Ontario now has the largest subnational debt in the world. The very same individuals responsible for killing the Ontario economy are now doing the same for Trudeau, killing our jobs, our hope for the future, and our freedom. As we endure the wreckage of Trudeau and his government's successive failures, he gropes for tighter control of our lives. Let's start there. Our Governor General, cut free from the inextricable binding, has been launched into her ejection capsule from our planetary spaceship out of the space-time continuum. She dismissed people of faith when she said, and I quote, "Can you believe that still today, in learned society, we are still debating and still questioning whether life was a divine intervention," end of quote. People of faith wish her well in her future endeavors. His other favorite astronaut has threatened to invoke the Emergencies Act. This comes from the Liberal Party, who tried to scare voters by saying Harper would put soldiers in the streets. Whatever the Liberals accuse Conservatives of is what they themselves plan to do. Now, a year into the virus crisis, Trudeau is talking about banning travel for the rest of Canadians. Is the Canadian public going to do penance for whomever took government jets to the Caribbean over the Christmas break? More worrisome is many Canadians are accepting of these harsh measures because they're scared and confused. The government-subsidized media has fomented panic. In the early days of the virus arriving in Canada, the government did nothing. Flights kept on coming in from Wuhan and other infected parts of China. He sent what we have left after bulldozing the national emergency stores of PPE into landfills to China. Left with nothing, we had to rely on China for supplies. Once a test became available, it was rationed only to those who had symptoms, except for the military. Just before the earliest reported known case of COVID was identified, over 100 of our military athletes returned from Wuhan, China, the epicenter of the epidemic, with reportedly a third of them ill. Some of them have reported having had pneumonia. They were fanned out across Canada to their home bases. Naturally, they wanted to know if they'd had the virus and asked to be tested. They were refused. The Surgeon General at the time denied they could have contracted it. He's been replaced and therefore cannot be called before committee for questioning. The Surgeon General reports to the Minister of Defense. The Minister of Defense takes his orders from the Prime Minister, Trudeau. Why didn't Trudeau want them to be tested? Trudeau shut down the Defense Committee for almost a year until after the six soldiers arrived. So they arrived back in October of 2019, and almost a year later, the Defense Committee had still been shut down. So why has he only allowed for the testing of COVID antibodies on healthy blood donors? Why doesn't he have those soldiers who competed in Wuhan during the outbreak tested for the antibodies? Why has Trudeau prevented rapid testing from being used in Canada until recently? Just this week, he finally allowed the millions of Spartan kits manufactured in Canada to be released to Canadians. Is it because we have zero vaccines arriving in Canada? Trudeau put all our vaccine eggs in one Chinese communist basket when he partnered with the government of Canada with the Chinese pharmaceutical company. That Chinese company, CanSino Bio, is using fundamental Canadian research paid for by Canadian taxpayers, which apparently we just gave them without a licensing deal. Yesterday, government documents revealed that 5 days after Trudeau signed his deal with CanSino, the Canadian government learned the communists were not going to release the vaccine to Canada. Trudeau covered up that information for months and months. It was only August that Trudeau finally gave up on his dream of a Chinese-supplied vaccine. We could have been placing the first orders before any other country if we had opted to go with any of a number of Western pharmaceuticals. Instead, Trudeau cut a bad deal with the communist, covered up the failure, and only acted to fix it after the damage was discovered. Trudeau's failed communist vaccine cover-up was exposed yesterday. Today, we learned even more explosive facts about Trudeau's failure on testing. Those soldiers who returned from Wuhan should have received antibody tests to detect if they had been exposed. I asked the health minister in April when Health Canada would approve an antibody test. Germany, the UK, and the United States had already conducted large surveys testing thousands of their citizens for antibodies. I asked the minister again and again over the spring, when would the antibody test be approved and available? Well, once an antibody test was finally approved, I asked when would we see the data from the widespread testing. The minister said that a special immunity task force would be in charge of antibody tests and collecting the data. Today, the Globe and Mail reported The data was useless. Nearly a year has been wasted. In the most damning quote from the story, we learned that Health Canada did not want to approve an antibody test. This is a direct quote from the Globe and Mail story. Quote, Health Canada was reticent to approve serology tests, so the task force began developing its own. Allow that to sink in. Why didn't Trudeau want Canadians to know if they have had COVID? A raging pandemic spreading a novel virus. The entire global economy had been closed down. And in the midst of that, we had a Liberal government that refused to approve antibody tests. They didn't want Canadians to know if they were immune. Was this Liberal incompetence? Was it Liberal arrogance? Or was it part of a Liberal agenda? Even once we defeat this government and launch a massive public inquiry, we may never know what drove this government to delay antibody testing and then to completely fail to use antibody testing to limit the damage caused by the pandemic and the lockdowns. Speaking of Liberal cover-ups, we only learned about the Surgeon General's letter denying the request of soldiers to be tested because it was leaked to a reporter. Yesterday, that reporter posted a video of the RCMP knocking on his door, asking to come into his home, and then proceed to threaten him. They asked the reporter if he was aware of Canada's Security of Information Act. Most reporters who cover federal politics are very aware of the Security of Information Act. The RCMP officer actually admits on tape that he's not an expert on the Security of Information Act. Obviously, the RCMP officer is not an expert. If he was an expert, he would never have gone to the reporter's house in the first place. The Surgeon General's letter was not classified. If the letter was not classified, then there's no investigation. Yet 2 officers were instructed to go and intimidate a reporter. Will Canadian news media react with outrage and horror with the news of one of their own being targeted by Trudeau? Don't hold your breath. We know Trudeau wants to call an election before the money runs out. That's why the Liberals are going to rush through changes to the Elections Act. Now, we have to be very careful discussing any changes that Trudeau wants to make to the Elections Act. I'm not suggesting the government is changing the rules to give themselves an electoral advantage. We have to be careful. I've posted a survey at cherylgallant.com/vote-law. I've listed out the changes Trudeau wants to make to the law. I'd like you to tell me what you think about the changes. So go to cherylgallant.com/vote-law and please complete the survey. That's all the time we have today. Live from Ottawa, this is Cheryl Gallant, wishing you a good night.